Let us now come to consider who the souls are that enter the second mansions and what they do there. I want to say very little to you about this, because elsewhere I have written of it at length, and it will be impossible for me to avoid repeating a great deal of this, because I cannot remember anything of what I said. If it could be arranged in a different form, I am quite sure you would not mind, as we are never tired of books that treat of this, numerous though they are. This chapter has to do with those who have already begun to practice prayer and who realize the importance of not remaining in the first mansions, but who often are not yet resolute enough to leave those mansions, and will not avoid occasions of sin, which is a very perilous condition. But it is a very great mercy that they should contrive to escape from the snakes and other poisonous creatures, if only for short periods, and should realize that it is good to flee from them. In some ways, these souls have a much harder time than those in the first mansions, but they are in less peril, for they seem now to understand their position, and there is great hope that they will get farther into the castle still. I say they have a harder time because the souls in the first mansions are, as it were, not only dumb, but can hear nothing, and so it is not such a trial to them to be unable to speak. The others, who can hear and not speak, would find the trial much harder to bear. But that is no reason for envying those who do not hear, for after all it is a great thing to be able to understand what is said to one. These souls, then, can understand the Lord when He calls them. For, as they gradually get nearer to the place where His Majesty dwells, He becomes a very good neighbor to them. And such are His mercy and goodness that, even when we are engaged in our worldly pastimes and businesses and pleasures and hagglings, when we are falling into sins and rising from them again, because these creatures are at once so venomous and so active, and it is so dangerous for us to be among them, that it will be a miracle if we escape stumbling over them and falling. In spite of all that, this Lord of ours is so anxious that we should desire Him and strive after His companionship that He calls us ceaselessly, time after time, to approach Him. And this voice of His is so sweet that the poor soul is consumed with grief at being unable to do His bidding immediately, and thus, as I say, it suffers more than if it could not hear Him. I do not mean by this that He speaks to us and calls us in the precise way which I shall describe later. His appeals come through the conversations of good people, or from sermons, or through the reading of good books. And there are many other ways, of which you have heard, in which God calls us. Or they come through sicknesses and trials, or by means of truths which God teaches us at times when we are engaged in prayer. However feeble such prayers may be, God values them highly. You must not despise this first favor, sisters, nor be disconsolate, even though you have not responded immediately to the Lord's call. For His Majesty is quite prepared to wait for many days, and even years, especially when He sees we are persevering and have good desires. This is the most necessary thing here. If we have this, we cannot fail to gain greatly. Nevertheless, the assault which the devils now make upon the soul, in all kinds of ways, is terrible, and the soul suffers more than in the preceding mansions. For there it was deaf and dumb, or at least it could hear very little, and so it offered less resistance, like one who to a great extent has lost hope of gaining the victory. Here the understanding is keener and the faculties are more alert, while the clash of arms and the noise of cannon are so loud that the soul cannot help hearing them. For here the devils once more show the soul these vipers, that is, the things of the world, and they pretend that earthly pleasures are almost eternal. They remind the soul of the esteem in which it is held in the world, of its friends and relatives, of the way in which its health will be endangered by penances, which the soul always wants to do when it first enters this mansion, and of impediments of 1,000 other kinds. Oh, Jesus! What confusion the devils bring about in the poor soul, and how distressed it is, not knowing if it ought to proceed farther or return to the room where it was before. On the other hand, reason tells the soul how mistaken it is in thinking that all these earthly things are of the slightest value by comparison with what it is seeking. Faith instructs it in what it must do to find satisfaction. Memory shows it how all these things come to an end, and reminds it that those who have derived so much enjoyment from the things which it has seen have died. Sometimes they have died suddenly and been quickly forgotten by all. people whom we once knew to be very prosperous are now beneath the ground, and we trample upon their graves, and often, as we pass them, we reflect that their bodies are seething with worms. Of these and many other things the soul is reminded by memory. The will inclines to love one in whom it has seen so many acts and signs of love, some of which it would like to return. In particular, the will shows the soul how this true lover never leaves it, but goes with it everywhere and gives it life and being. Then the understanding comes forward and makes the soul realize that, for however many years it may live, it can never hope to have a better friend, for the world is full of falsehood, and these pleasures which the devil pictures to it are accompanied by trials and cares and annoyances, and tells it to be certain that outside this castle it will find neither security nor peace. Let it refrain from visiting one house after another when its own house is full of good things, if it will only enjoy them. How fortunate it is to be able to find all that it needs, as it were, at home, especially when it has a host who will put all good things into its possession, unless, like the prodigal son, it desires to go astray and eat the food of the swine. It is reflections of this kind which vanquish devils. But, oh, my God and Lord, how everything is ruined by the vain habits we fall into and the way everyone else follows them. So dead is our faith that we desire what we see more than what faith tells us about. Though what we actually see is that people who pursue these visible things meet with nothing but ill fortune. All this is the work of these poisonous creatures which we have been describing. For, if a man is bitten by a viper, his whole body is poisoned and swells up. And so it is in this case, and yet we take no care of ourselves. Obviously a great deal of attention will be necessary if we are to be cured, and only the great mercy of God will preserve us from death. The soul will certainly suffer great trials at this time, especially if the devil sees that its character and habits are such that it is ready to make further progress. All the powers of hell will combine to drive it back again. Ah, my Lord, it is here that we have need of thine aid, without which we can do nothing. Of thy mercy, allow not this soul to be deluded and led astray when its journey is but begun. Give it light so that it may see how all its welfare consists in this, and may flee from evil companionship. It is a very great thing for a person to associate with others who are walking in the right way. To mix, not only with those whom he sees in the rooms where he himself is, but with those whom he knows to have entered the rooms nearer the center, for they will be of great help to him, and he can get into such close touch with them that they will take him with them. Let him have a fixed determination not to allow himself to be beaten, for, if the devil sees that he has firmly resolved to lose his life and his peace and everything that he can offer him rather than to return to the first room, he will very soon cease troubling him. Let him play the man and not be like those who went down on their knees in order to drink when they went to battle. I forget with whom, but let him be resolute, for he is going forth to fight within the devils, and there are no better weapons than the cross. There is one thing so important that, although I have said it on other occasions, I will repeat it once more here. It is that at the beginning one must not think of such things as spiritual favors, for that is a very poor way of starting to build such a large and beautiful edifice. If it is begun upon sand, it will all collapse. Souls which build like that will never be free from annoyances and temptations. For it is not in these mansions, but in those which are farther on, that it rains manna. Once there, the soul has all that it desires, because it desires only what is the will of God. It is a curious thing. Here we are, meeting with hindrances and suffering from imperfections by the thousand, with our virtues so young that they have not yet learned how to walk. In fact, they have only just been born. God grant that they have even been born at all. And yet we are not ashamed to be wanting consolations in prayer and to be complaining about periods of aridity. This must not be true of you, sisters. Embrace the cross which your spouse bore upon his shoulders, and realize that this cross is yours to carry too. Let her who is capable of the greatest suffering suffer most for him, and she will have the most perfect freedom. All other things are of quite secondary importance. If the Lord should grant them to you, give him heartfelt thanks. You may think that you will be full of determination to resist outward trials if God will only grant you inward favors. His Majesty knows best what is suitable for us. It is not for us to advise him what to give us, for he can rightly reply that we know not what we ask. All that the beginner in prayer has to do, and you must not forget this, for it is very important, is to labor and be resolute and prepare himself with all possible diligence to bring his will into conformity with the will of God. As I shall say later, you may be quite sure that this comprises the very greatest perfection which can be attained on the spiritual road. The more perfectly a person practices it, the more he will receive of the Lord and the greater the progress he will make on this road. Do not think we have to use strange jargon or dabble in things of which we have no knowledge or understanding. Our entire welfare is to be found in what I have described. If we go astray at the very beginning and want the Lord to do our will and to lead us just as our fancy dictates, how can this building possibly have a firm foundation? Let us see that we do as much as in us lies and avoid these venomous reptiles, for often it is the Lord's will that we should be persecuted and afflicted by evil thoughts, which we cannot cast out, and also by aridities. And sometimes he even allows these reptiles to bite us, so that we may learn better how to be on our guard in the future and see if we are really grieved at having offended him. If, then, you sometimes fail, do not lose heart, or cease striving to make progress, for even out of your fall God will bring good. Just as a man selling an antidote will drink poison before he takes it in order to prove its power. If nothing else could show us what wretched creatures we are and what harm we do to ourselves by dissipating our desires, this war which goes on within us would be sufficient to do so and to lead us back to recollection. Can any evil be greater than the evil which we find in our own house? What hope can we have of being able to rest in other people's homes if we cannot rest in our own? For none of our friends and relatives are as near to us as our faculties, with which we have always to live, whether we like it or not, and yet our faculties seem to be making war upon us, as if they were resentful of the war made upon them by our vices. Peace, peace, said the Lord, my sisters, and many a time he spoke words of peace to his apostles. Believe me, unless we have peace, and strive for peace in our own home, we shall not find it in the homes of others. Let this war now cease. By the blood which Christ shed for us, I beg this of those who have not begun to enter within themselves, and those who have begun to do so must not allow such warfare to turn them back. They must realize that to fall a second time is worse than to fall once. They can see that it will lead them to ruin. Let them place their trust, not in themselves, but in the mercy of God, and they will see how His Majesty can lead them on from one group of mansions to another and set them on safe ground where these beasts cannot harass or hurt them, for He will place the beasts in their power and laugh them to scorn. And then they themselves, even in this life, will enjoy many more good things than they could ever desire. As I said first of all, I have already written to you about how you ought to behave when you have to suffer these disturbances with which the devil torments you, and about how recollection cannot be begun by making strenuous efforts, but must come gently, after which you will be able to practice it for longer periods at a time. So I will say no more about this now, except that it is very important for you to consult people of experience, for otherwise you will imagine that you are doing yourselves great harm by pursuing your necessary occupations. But, provided we do not abandon our prayer, the Lord will turn everything we do to our profit, even though we may find no one to teach us. There is no remedy for this evil of which we have been speaking except to start again at the beginning. Otherwise the soul will keep on losing a little more every day. Please God that it may come to realize this. Some of you might suppose that, if it is such a bad thing to turn back, it would have been better never to have begun, but to have remained outside the castle. I told you, however, at the outset, and the Lord Himself says this, that he who goes into danger shall perish in it, and that the door by which we can enter this castle is prayer. It is absurd to think that we can enter heaven without first entering our own souls. Without getting to know ourselves, and reflecting upon the wretchedness of our nature and what we owe to God, and continually imploring His mercy. The Lord Himself says, "No one will ascend to my Father, but by me." I am not sure if those are the exact words, but I think they are, and, "He that sees me sees my Father." Well, if we never look at him or think of what we owe him, and of the death which he suffered for our sakes, I do not see how we can get to know him or do good works in his service. For what can be the value of faith without works, or of works which are not united with the merits of our Lord Jesus Christ? And what but such thoughts can arouse us to love this Lord? May it please his majesty to grant us to understand how much we cost him, that the servant is not greater than his Lord, that we must needs work if we would enjoy his glory, and that for that reason we must perforce pray, lest we enter continually into temptation.